the small town of Murray, Kentucky, during the 1980s, a child was born who would later become one of the most infamous teenage killers in American history. His name was Roderick Justin Ferrell, known to the world simply as Rod Ferrell. Born on March 28, 1980, Rod's life began like many others, but beneath the surface lay a growing darkness that would eventually consume him, and tragically, others around him. Rod's childhood was anything but stable. He grew up primarily under the care of his mother, Sandra Gibson, who herself struggled with emotional instability and financial difficulties. Sandra was eccentric, often dabbling in unusual spiritual beliefs and alternative lifestyles. She introduced Rod at an early age to the world of fantasy role-playing games, mystical ideas, and an obsession with vampires. What began as harmless fascination would later spiral into something far more dangerous. Unlike other children his age, Rod did not outgrow his fascination with fantasy and the macabre. While many children might enjoy scary stories or Halloween costumes, Rod immersed himself in an alternate identity. He believed he was a vampire. He claimed to be a 500-year-old vampire named Vesago, a character he created to embody his darker fantasies. This persona gave him a sense of power and identity that he lacked in the real world. For Rod, the line between fantasy and reality blurred until he could no longer separate the two. As Rod grew older, his obsession deepened. He dressed in black trench coats, wore Gothic jewelry, and often surrounded himself with imagery of death, blood, and eternal life. He was drawn to the Gothic subculture, which was gaining attention in the early 1990s, but even within that world, his fixation stood out, while others embraced Gothic fashion and music as a form of expression. Rod pushed it further, into something much darker and more dangerous. It wasn't long before Rod began to attract like-minded individuals, teenagers who felt like outsiders in their own small towns, gravitated toward his confidence, his theatrical personality, and his willingness to defy authority. Rod became the leader of what would later be known as the Vampire Clan, a group of disaffected teenagers who believed they were vampires, bonded together by rituals, blood drinking, and a rejection of traditional society. For these teenagers, Rod offered something they desperately sought: belonging. He gave them a community where they weren't mocked for being different, where their fascination with the dark and forbidden was not just tolerated, but celebrated. Yet what they didn't realize was that Rod's leadership would eventually drag them into a nightmare. Behind the persona of Vesago, Rod manipulated his followers with promises of power, immortality, and freedom from the world that rejected them. He convinced them that they were not just misfits, but chosen beings, set apart from humanity. Rituals often involve drinking blood, sometimes from each other's arms, sometimes from small animals. These acts, while shocking to outsiders, became a twisted form of bonding for the clan, reinforcing their loyalty to Rod and his delusions of grandeur. Rod's mother, Sandra, was not a typical parental figure. Instead of discouraging his dark fantasies, she often encouraged them, and in some cases, even claimed to share them. She was rumored to have engaged in her own flirtations with the occult and vampiric role playing, blurring the parental boundaries that might have otherwise reigned in Rod's behavior. This lack of stability at home only strengthened his need to seek control and identity elsewhere. By his mid-teens, Rod was completely consumed by his vampire identity. Teachers, classmates, and community members noticed his increasingly strange behavior. He was violent, unpredictable, and unafraid to speak openly about death and immortality. Some dismissed him as an attention-seeking teenager, but others sensed something deeply troubling beneath the surface. Unfortunately, their warnings went unheeded. The vampire clan grew, attracting troubled teenagers from Kentucky and Florida who felt alienated from mainstream society. Among them were Charity Kesey, Heather Wendorf, Dana Cooper, and Scott Anderson, all young people who found comfort in Rod's fantasy world. But what began as role play soon transformed into something deadly serious. Rod promised his followers a family, a clan bound together by loyalty and blood. He told them they could escape their ordinary lives and live forever as immortals. For young, impressionable teenagers searching for meaning, this vision was intoxicating. But Rod's charisma was not harmless. He was increasingly manipulative, controlling, and unhinged. What his followers saw as leadership was in truth a dangerous mix of delusion and dominance. By 1996, Rod was only 16 years old, but he already saw himself as a powerful figure, leading a group of devoted followers. His vampire persona, Vesago, had become inseparable from his real identity. He believed he was destined for something greater, something beyond the mortal world. This belief, combined with his influence over vulnerable teens, set the stage for tragedy. The turning point came when Heather Wendorf, one of Rod's followers, confided in him about her unhappiness at home. She claimed her parents, Richard and Ruth Wendorf, were abusive, though later evidence suggested that this was not true. Rod, already immersed in his fantasies of power and rebellion, saw this as an opportunity. He convinced himself and his followers that rescuing Heather required more than just running away. It required destroying her so-called oppressors. In Rod's twisted logic, the act of murder became not only justified but necessary. It was a step deeper into his identity as a vampire, a violent ritual that would cement his role as leader and protector of his clan. What had begun as teenage rebellion and escapism was now spiraling into a plan for brutal, irreversible violence. As the group prepared to travel from Kentucky to Florida, the fantasy world Rod had created was about to collide with reality in the most horrific way. The vampire clan's bond, once sealed in harmless rituals and teenage games, was now bound for bloodshed. The stage was set for one of the most shocking crimes of the 1990s. Murders carried out in the name of fantasy, obsession, and the dark charisma of a troubled teenager who believed he was immortal. By the fall of 1996, Rod Ferrell's vampire clan had become more than just a group of outcast teenagers. To Rod, it was his family, his creation. To his followers, he was a leader, a protector, and, in their eyes, a figure of dark power. The fantasy world they lived in was consuming their reality, and when Heather Wendorf, a quiet teenager from Eustis, Florida, complained about her home life, Rod saw an opening to prove himself as the savior he imagined he was. Heather told Rod and the others that she felt trapped by her parents, Richard and Ruth Wendorf. She described them as overbearing, controlling, and even abusive. While there was little evidence of real abuse, Heather's frustration and teenage rebellion resonated with Rod. In his mind, he wasn't just helping Heather run away. He was liberating her. And liberation, in Rod's twisted world. On November 25, 1996, Rod, accompanied by Scott Anderson, Dana Cooper, and Charity Kesey, set out on a journey from Kentucky to Florida. The plan was simple at first: to meet Heather, initiate her fully into the vampire clan, and then all of them would leave together, escaping into their fantasy of freedom and immortality. But for Rod, the trip carried a darker purpose. He told his followers that in order to free Heather, he would have to kill her parents. To him, this wasn't murder. It was a ritual. He spoke of it as though it were destiny, an act that would bind them together forever. His followers, deeply under his influence, didn't resist. They didn't question him. Instead, they let his words carry them toward the brink of horror. When the group arrived in Florida, they met Heather in secret. She was excited to see them, eager for an escape from the life she claimed she hated. But Heather had no idea how far Rod was willing to go. She may have dreamed of rebellion, of leaving her small town behind, but she hadn't anticipated murder. On the evening of November 25, Rod and Scott Anderson made their way to the Wendorf family home. Richard and Ruth were unaware that their daughter's teenage friends were approaching with deadly intentions. Inside the house, the couple carried on with their ordinary routines, never imagining that violence was about to shatter their lives. Rod and Scott entered the home through the garage. There, Rod found a crowbar, a weapon that would soon become the instrument of brutal violence. His vampire persona, Vesago, had fully taken control. He believed this was not just an act of killing, but a rite of passage. Blood spilled to solidify his identity as an immortal leader. Their first victim was Richard Wendorf, who was asleep on the living room couch. Without hesitation, Rod raised the crowbar and brought it down with vicious force. The blows were relentless. Richard had no chance to defend himself. The attack was so violent that it shocked even Scott, who later described Rod's rage as almost inhuman. Next, Rod turned to Ruth Wendorf, who was in the shower at the time. When she emerged, she was confronted by Rod, still armed with the crowbar. Despite her pleas, he struck her repeatedly until she collapsed. The ferocity of the attack was brutal, leaving no doubt about his intent. Rod later claimed that he felt nothing, no remorse, no hesitation. To him, it was simply necessary, part of the ritual, part of his destiny as Vesago. After the murders, Rod and Scott quickly left the scene. Heather, who had been waiting outside with the others, was unaware of the carnage that had just unfolded. She believed they were simply running away together, leaving her parents behind. But by the time she stepped inside, the reality was undeniable. Her parents were dead, their lives stolen, in a matter of minutes by the boy, who claimed to be a vampire. The group fled the Wendorf home in the family's Ford Explorer, taking valuables, credit cards, and other items that would help them escape. Their destination was New Orleans, a city Rod believed to be a haven for vampires and misfits, a place where they could disappear into the shadows and live out their dark fantasies. But even as they drove away, the illusion of freedom was already collapsing. News of the murders spread quickly, shocking the quiet community of Eustis. Authorities immediately suspected Heather's disappearance was connected. When investigators discovered the missing Ford Explorer, the hunt for Rod Ferrell and his vampire clan began. On the road, the group tried to cling to their fantasy. They spoke of living forever, of starting a new life free from the chains of normal society. But reality crept in. They were teenagers, inexperienced, reckless, and now fugitives in a nationwide manhunt. Meanwhile, back in Florida, the crime scene told investigators everything they needed to know. The brutality of the attacks pointed to rage, but also to ritual. Richard and Ruth had been bludgeoned so violently that the scene looked more like a massacre than a burglary. Detectives began piecing together the lives of the Wendorf family and quickly learned of Heather's strange new friends from Kentucky. The puzzle was coming together, and Rod Ferrell's name surfaced almost immediately. For Rod, however, there was no turning back. In his mind, he had crossed the threshold. He wasn't just playing a role anymore. He believed he had become the vampire leader he always claimed to be. But his grip on his followers was beginning to weaken. The weight of murder, the reality of what they had done, and the growing pressure of pursuit began to fracture the group's unity. After several days on the run, the vampire clan made their way to Louisiana. But the dream of disappearing into New Orleans never came true. Instead, the group ended up in Baton Rouge, where their journey would come to an abrupt and dramatic end. In the end, what Rod saw as a ritual of liberation and immortality was nothing more than brutal murder, and the world he had built for himself and his followers, a world of vampires, rituals, and fantasy, was about to collapse under the crushing weight of reality, justice, and consequence. The next chapter of Rod Ferrell's story would no longer be about fantasy. It would be about capture, trial, and the grim truth of what happens when delusion turns to violence. After the gruesome murders of Richard and Ruth Wendorf in Eustis, Florida, Rod Ferrell and his vampire clan were on the run, clinging desperately to their dark fantasy. The group's journey from Kentucky to Florida and then toward New Orleans had begun as a mission in Rod's mind. A mission of liberation, loyalty, and immortality. But it was quickly unraveling under the relentless pressure of law enforcement. By late November 1996, the murders had gained nationwide attention. Local authorities in Florida, along with the FBI, were now actively searching for Rod and his followers. What made the case particularly alarming was the nature of the crime: brutal, ritualistic, and committed by a teenager. The public was both horrified and fascinated. How could a 16-year-old boy commit such heinous acts? And how had he persuaded other teenagers to follow him into murder. Rod's delusion of invincibility fueled his reckless behavior. He believed that his identity as Vesago, the immortal vampire, protected him from the consequences of the mortal world. But the law was closing in. On November 29, 1996, law enforcement tracked the group to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. After receiving tips from witnesses who had seen them traveling suspiciously, Rod and his followers were found at a small motel, behaving erratically, still immersed in their fantasy. When police approached, Rod did not resist violently, but his behavior was bizarre. He wore his trademark black clothing, dark sunglasses, and maintained the persona of Vesago, insisting that he was immortal and untouchable. Officers later recounted that he seemed detached from reality, oscillating between calm confidence and moments of intense agitation. The delusion that had driven him to murder was now blinding him to the very real consequences of his actions. Rod was arrested without incident, but the case had only just begun. His followers, Scott Anderson, Dana Cooper, and Charity Kesey, were also detained. Heather Wendorf, who had fled with the group but had not participated in the killings, was taken into protective custody. Authorities began piecing together the sequence of events, relying on interviews, confessions, and forensic evidence from the Wendorf home. The brutality of the crime scene left investigators convinced that the murders had been premeditated and carried out with chilling intent. During interrogation, Rod's statements were a mix of confession and delusion. He admitted to the killings, but framed them within the narrative of his vampire identity, claiming that he had acted in accordance with Vesago's commands. He described the murders as a ritual and insisted that he had been compelled by the need to protect and free Heather. His testimony revealed a mind deeply immersed in fantasy, yet fully capable of committing horrific violence. Rod's youth complicated the legal process. At 16, he was a minor, but the severity of the crime, double murder, prompted prosecutors to seek adult charges, arguing that the nature of the killings demonstrated a level of planning and awareness that justified trial in adult court. This decision sparked debate about juvenile justice and whether a teenager, no matter how disturbed, could fully comprehend the consequences of such actions. The trial began in 1997 and quickly became a spectacle. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including Rod's own confessions, witness testimonies, and forensic findings. Experts testified about the psychological state of Rod and his followers, highlighting the manipulative influence he wielded over the vampire clan. Psychiatric evaluations suggested that Rod suffered from delusional disorder, yet the court ultimately found him competent to stand trial. Rod's defense team argued that he was a product of a troubled home, heavily influenced by his mother and by the subculture of gothic and vampire role-playing. They painted a picture of a lonely teenager lost in fantasy, whose perception of reality had been warped. Yet, while this defense elicited some sympathy, it could not overcome the undeniable fact 2 adults were dead, and the brutality of their murders left no room for leniency. Witnesses, including Heather Wendorf and the other vampire clan members, provided chilling testimony about Rod's obsession with vampires and his insistence that violence was necessary. They described his charisma and manipulative power, recounting how he convinced them that following his orders was essential for survival in their fantasy world. The court saw this as evidence of premeditation and control, establishing that Rod had orchestrated the murders rather than acting impulsively. During the trial, Rod appeared detached, often staring blankly or speaking in his Vesago persona. His bizarre behavior fascinated the media and public alike, turning the courtroom into a stage for a real-life horror story. Yet beneath the theatrics lay the grim reality. The victims' families were forced to relive the details of their deaths, and the community grappled with the horrifying thought that a teenage boy could be so fully consumed by fantasy that he would commit murder. On June 27, 1998, the jury reached a verdict. Rod Ferrell was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with additional charges for burglary and assault related to the Wendorf killings. The prosecution argued successfully that his actions were deliberate, planned, and executed with clear intent, leaving little doubt about his culpability. The sentencing reflected the severity of the crimes. Rod was sentenced to death, making him one of the youngest people in the United States to receive such a sentence at the time. However, following appeals and changes in Florida law concerning juvenile offenders, his sentence was later reduced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His followers, who had assisted in the escape but did not participate in the murders, received lesser sentences, though the impact of the crime would shadow all of them for the rest of their lives. In prison, Rod Ferrell has remained an enigmatic figure. While his life outside the walls ended in violence, inside, he became a cautionary tale of the dangers of obsession, delusion, and the influence of charismatic figures over vulnerable minds. Psychologists continue to study his case, examining how fantasy, social isolation, and manipulation can intersect to create tragedy. The story of Rod Ferrell is a stark reminder that reality and fantasy can collide with devastating consequences. A teenage obsession with vampires escalated into murder, affecting families, communities, and a generation of followers. The vampire clan, once a symbol of teenage rebellion, became an emblem of tragedy. And Rod Ferrell, the boy who believed he was immortal, would spend the rest of his life behind bars, living in the reality he once thought he could escape. As the world watched the trial unfold, the dark allure of the vampire myth collided with the harsh truths of crime, leaving an indelible mark on the history of American juvenile crime. Rod Ferrell's name became synonymous with teenage obsession turned deadly, a chilling example of how delusion can escalate into irreversible violence. After the trial and sentencing, Rod Ferrell began his life behind bars. A life very different from the fantasy of immortality and power he once envisioned as Vesago, the vampire. At 16, he was thrust from a world of gothic glamour, rituals, and loyal followers into the stark, unyielding reality of a maximum security prison. The walls that confined him were no longer metaphorical. They were literal, cold, and inescapable. Rod's early years in prison were marked by adjustment, reflection, and the occasional attempts to maintain his vampire persona. He reportedly continued to dress in black and would occasionally refer to himself as Vesago, a habit that alarmed some staff but fascinated others. However, the prison system allowed little room for fantasy. Life behind bars is governed by routine, strict rules, and constant surveillance, concepts that clash sharply with the self-fashioned identity of a teenage vampire lord. Psychologists and prison officials closely monitored Rod, examining his psychological state and behavior. Many were struck by the complexity of his personality. He was both manipulative and isolated, charismatic yet withdrawn, a teenager who had committed atrocities, yet still exhibited moments of vulnerability. Reports suggested that he spent considerable time reading, reflecting, and, at times, attempting to navigate life within the prison hierarchy without resorting to violence. Rod's life in prison also sparked discussions about juvenile offenders and the ethics of sentencing. He became part of a larger debate in the United States about how to treat minors who commit heinous crimes. Advocates for reform argued that despite the brutality of his actions, Rod was still a teenager, capable of growth and change. Critics countered that the premeditated nature of his murders and the manipulation of his followers demonstrated a level of awareness and culpability that justified his life sentence. Over the years, Rod Ferrell has remained a controversial figure in true crime discussions. Documentaries, news reports, and books have examined his case, focusing on the extraordinary combination of youth, charisma, and obsession with the supernatural that led to murder. The case raises questions about how fantasy can influence vulnerable minds, how authority and manipulation can manifest in teenage groups, and how society should respond when delusion crosses the line into deadly action. The story of the vampire clan continues to fascinate criminologists, psychologists, and the public alike. Rod's ability to convince his peers to follow him into murder highlights the dangers of groupthink and charismatic influence. It also underscores the complexity of adolescent psychology, how identity, belonging, and rebellion can intertwine with fantasy and lead to extreme behavior. In many ways, Rod Ferrell's crimes are studied as an extreme example of what can happen when imagination, obsession, and moral detachment converge. Despite his confinement, Rod has occasionally maintained contact with the outside world through letters and limited interviews. In these communications, he has at times reflected on his past actions, though always through a lens that blends reality with the remnants of his vampire persona. Some letters suggest remorse. Others reveal a continued fascination with the mythology that shaped him. This duality, the tension between acknowledgement and fantasy, remains a defining aspect of his character. The victims of his crimes, Richard and Ruth Wendorf, left a lasting legacy of grief for their family, friends, and community. The brutality of the murders ensured that the case would never be forgotten, serving as a somber reminder of the consequences of obsession and manipulation. Memorials and remembrances for the Wendorfs have kept their memory alive, while their tragic deaths continue to underscore the human cost of Rod's delusions. Culturally, the Rod Ferrell case has influenced media portrayals of vampire subcultures and teenage crime. True crime documentaries, podcasts, and books have used his story as an example of how fantasy and reality can dangerously collide. In some ways, it has also contributed to moral panic about teenagers involved in gothic subcultures or role-playing games. Though experts caution against oversimplifying the causes of such extreme behavior, Rod's case was never just about vampires. It was about manipulation, identity, and the dark potential of charismatic influence. In prison, Rod Ferrell's daily existence is now dictated by rules, schedules, and the reality that immortality exists only in imagination. He is housed in a Florida correctional facility, serving life without the possibility of parole. The fantasy of Vesago has been stripped of its power in the physical world, replaced by the harshness of concrete walls, limited freedom, and the ongoing awareness of the lives he destroyed. Yet the legend of the vampire clan continues to haunt the public imagination. Rod Ferrell's story serves as both a cautionary tale and a subject of morbid fascination. It reminds us that evil can wear many faces, sometimes a charismatic teenager, sometimes a manipulative leader, sometimes a dreamer lost in fantasy. And it reminds us that behind every sensational story, there are real victims, grieving families, and communities forever changed by violence. Today, Rod Ferrell remains imprisoned, a living reminder of the deadly potential of obsession. His story resonates in popular culture, psychology, and criminology as a warning fantasy, when fused with delusion and charisma, can have devastating, irreversible consequences. The vampire clan, once a symbol of teenage rebellion and identity seeking, is now remembered solely for the murder, manipulation, and tragedy that Rod Ferrell brought into the real world. In the end, the story of Rod Ferrell is not just about vampires, teenage fantasy, or rebellion. It is a story of morality, consequence, and the fragile line between imagination and reality. It is a tale that will continue to captivate and horrify, a chilling reminder that the darkest fantasies, when acted upon, can leave scars that last far beyond the imagination of those who create them. Rod Ferrell, the boy who once believed he was immortal, will remain behind bars for the rest of his life, a testament to the consequences of obsession and the human cost of delusion.